The Festival of Silver Light transformed the royal palace into a place of wonder, and beauty crystal lanterns floated through the air and scattered prismatic rainbows across every surface, and the Valorian nobles wore their finest robes as they gathered to celebrate the most sacred day in their calendar. Dayan stood behind Princess Celes and watched the crowd with eyes that saw only threats. The intelligence reports had been clear about the timing, and the attackers would strike during the festival when security was spread thin and attention was focused on ceremony. He had tried to convince the queen to cancel the celebration, but she had refused. "We cannot show weakness," she had said. "The festival will proceed, and we will be ready for whatever comes." Dayan had spent the past 3 days preparing for this night. He had studied the palace layout until he knew every corridor and every hidden passage and every possible point of entry. He had identified the guards he could trust and positioned them at key locations throughout the building. He had given Celes a small communicator and made her promise to flee to the secure chamber. He had prepared if anything went wrong. Now, all he could do was wait and watch and hope that his preparations would be enough. Queen sat on her crystal throne at the head of the great hall and received the blessings of her people with grace and dignity. She looked beautiful and regal and completely at ease, but Dayan knew that she was as aware of the danger as he was. First sign of trouble came from the eastern wing, where an explosion shook the palace and sent servants screaming through the corridors. Dayan grabbed Celes by the arm and pulled her toward the exit. "Go to the secure chamber," he ordered. "I will find you when it is over." "What about you?" she demanded. "I need to warn your mother," he replied. "The princess is bait, and the queen is the true target." Understanding dawned in her silver eyes, and she nodded quickly. "Be careful," she said, and then she was gone with 2 trusted guards at her side. Pushed through the panicking crowd and fought his way toward the throne. More explosions rocked the palace, and he could hear the sounds of fighting from multiple directions. The attackers had come in force, just as the intelligence had predicted. He reached the throne room to find the queen surrounded by her personal guards and facing a group of armored figures who had breached the main doors, but these were not the true assassins. They were a distraction. Ainani scanned the room and spotted what he was looking for. Figure in the shadows behind the throne was moving toward the queen with a blade drawn, and this figure wore the uniform of her royal guard. Traitor Dayan ran. He crossed the distance in seconds and threw himself between the queen and the assassin. Just as the blade descended, the weapon pierced his chest, and the pain was white-hot and absolute, but his hand found the assassin's throat, and he squeezed with all his remaining strength until he felt bone crack beneath his fingers. They fell together, and Dayan landed on top of the dying traitor with the blade still buried in his chest. The queen's guards swarmed around them, and the fighting intensified. As reinforcements arrived from both sides, Dayan lay on the cold floor and watched his blood spread across the crystal tiles. Red among silver human among Valorian had done this before, and he had survived, and perhaps he would survive again. But the blade was deep, and he could feel his life draining away with every heartbeat. A face appeared above him, and it was the queen. She knelt beside him with silver tears streaming down her crystalline face, and her hands pressed against the wound in his chest. "You foolish, brave human," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "You have bled for my family twice now." "Third time?" Dayan managed to whisper. The cargo bay counted twice. She laughed despite the tears, and the sound was strange and beautiful. "Hold on," she commanded. "The healers are coming." The doors burst open again, and Silas ran into the throne room with her guards close behind. She had not gone to the secure chamber. Of course she had not. She dropped to her knees beside Dayan, and her silver eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "You promised to be careful," she accused him. "I lied," he admitted weakly. Her hands joined her mother's on his chest, and together they poured their healing power into his broken body. Warmth spread through him and pushed back the darkness that had been closing in, he felt. His heart strengthened and his lungs filled with air, and the bleeding slowed to a trickle. "Stay with us," Sally's pleaded. "You are not allowed to die." "I remember," he whispered. "You told me that before." The battle ended around them as the remaining attackers were killed or captured. The traitor faction had been exposed, and their external allies had fled when they realized their plan had failed. Dahan drifted in and out of consciousness as the healers worked to save his life. Woke in the same beautiful room where he had recovered before, with the same crystal ceiling scattering rainbows above him, but this time both the queen and the princess sat beside his bed. "You are making a habit of this," the queen said when she saw his eyes open. "I apologize." "Your Majesty," he replied. "I will try to be more careful in the future." "See that you do," she said, but there was warmth in her voice that had not been there before. She rose from her chair and looked down at him with an expression that held respect and something like affection. "I have a question for you, Sergeant Yoon," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Do you wish to return to human space?" she asked. "I will give you honors and wealth beyond anything you have ever known, and I will ensure that you want for nothing for the rest of your life." Dayan considered the offer and thought about Earth and about the life he had left behind. He thought about the soldiers he had lost, and the guilt he had carried, and the loneliness that had driven him to seek a posting on the far edge of civilization. Then he looked at Silas and saw the hope and fear in her silver eyes. She had become like a younger sister to him, and he could not imagine leaving her behind. He looked at the queen and saw a ruler who had trusted him when his own people had forgotten he existed. "I would like to stay," he said, "if you will have me." The queen smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something radiant. "I do not understand humans," she admitted. "I do not understand why you fight for people who are not your own, or why you bleed for strangers, or why you choose to stand when everyone else would run." She placed her crystalline hand over his heart where the newest scar was still healing. "But I have learned to trust what I do not understand," she continued, "and I would be honored to have you remain with my family." She spoke words in the ancient Valorian tongue, and her voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. When she finished, Daeon felt something change inside him. A bond had formed that went beyond duty or obligation. He belonged here now. Zalis threw her arms around him and hugged him tightly despite his protests about his injuries. "I knew you would stay," she whispered. "I knew it from the moment you stepped between me and those assassins." "How did you know?" he asked. "Because you are the kind of person who protects others," she replied. "And once you start protecting someone, you never stop." She was right. He had lost his squad and carried their memory as a burden for years. But now he had found a new family to protect, and he would guard them with everything he had. The queen left them alone, and Solly sat beside him and told him about the celebration the court was planning to honor his heroism. He tried to refuse the attention, but she would not hear of it. "You are a hero," she insisted, "whether you like it or not." "I'm just a soldier," he replied. "You are my guardian," she corrected, "and my friend, and now my family." Dahan looked at the ceiling and watched the rainbows dance across the crystal and felt something he had not felt in years. Peace in the histories of the Valorian Empire. They would write of the human who bled red among silver. They would tell stories of the soldier who killed 6 assassins to protect the princess and took a blade meant for a queen. They would remember Sergeant Yoon Dae-yeon not as a hero or a warrior, but as something more important, man who stayed not because he was commanded, but because he chose to call their world home, and in that choice he found the redemption he had been searching for all along. 2 weeks had passed since Dae-yeon accepted his new role, and every single day had been a battle of a different kind. The Valorian royal court was a place of beauty and danger where every smile hid a blade and every compliment concealed an insult. The Nobles looked at Dayan with open disgust and whispered behind their crystalline hands whenever he walked past. They called him the pet and the animal and Queen's joke, and they made sure he heard every word. Dayan ignored them all and focused. On his duty, he stood outside the princess's chambers every night and walked 3 steps behind her during the day and tasted her food before she ate and checked every room before she entered. The royal guards resented his presence and made their feelings known through small acts of disrespect and obstruction. They would arrive late to relieve him from his posts and forget to inform him of schedule changes and accidentally block his path in the corridors. Dayan endured it all without complaint, because he understood that his position threatened everything they believed about the natural order of things. A human had no place among Valorian royalty, and yet here he was. Princess Celeste defended him whenever she witnessed the mistreatment, and her fierce words often made the situation worse. "You should not fight my battles," Dayan told her one evening as they walked through the palace gardens. "It only makes them hate me more." "Then let them hate," she replied with a toss of her silver hair. "I will not stand by while they insult someone who saved my life. I am a soldier." He reminded her, "Insults do not wound me. They wow me," she admitted quietly. "When they attack you, they attack my judgment and my honor, and I cannot accept that." Dayan looked at her and saw something that surprised him. She was not defending him out of obligation or debt. She was defending him because she considered him a friend. The realization warmed something cold inside his chest that he had thought would never thaw. Again, their friendship had grown slowly over the 2 weeks through conversations that stretched late into the night. Celeste asked him about Earth and about human customs and about why he had left his homeworld to serve on a distant station. Dayan told her things he had never told anyone before. He told her about his squad and how they had died and how he blamed himself for not saving them. She listened without judgment, and when he finished, she placed her cool crystalline hand over his rough. "Human one, you carry too much guilt," she said, "and you punish yourself by seeking solitude when what you need is connection." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but connection means caring, and caring means pain when you lose someone." "Is that why you requested such a remote posting?" she asked. To avoid caring about anyone, he did not answer because the answer was obvious. "Well," she said with a small smile, "it is too late now because I care about you and you cannot escape that." The formal dinner that evening was a nightmare of whispered hostility and pointed stares. Dayan stood against the wall behind the princess and watched the gathered nobles with the same attention he would give to a room full of enemy combatants. Lord Calvarus approached the princess's table with a smile that held no warmth, and his silver eyes flickered toward Dayan with undisguised contempt. "Princess Celeste," he said with an elaborate bow, "how delightful to see you gracing us with your presence." "Lord Calvarus," she replied coolly, "what brings you to my table?" "I merely wish to inquire about your new companion," he said, and gestured toward Dayan. "I have heard such interesting stories about the human who follows you everywhere. Sergeant Yoon is my guardian," Sao said firmly, "appointed by my mother, the queen." "Yes, I am aware of the appointment," Calvarus replied, "though I confess I do not understand it." He turned to face Dayan directly, and his expression twisted into something ugly beneath its beautiful surface. "Tell me, human," he said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, "what makes you think you are worthy to stand among us?" The room fell silent, and every eye turned toward them. Dayan met the noble's gaze without flinching and kept his voice calm and even. "I do not think about worthiness, my lord," he replied. "I think about duty." "Duty," Calvarus repeated with a mocking laugh. "What does a human know of duty except to serve their betters?" "I know that I was given a task, and I will complete it," Dayan answered. "That is all that matters." "How admirably simple." The noble sneered. "But surely you must understand that your presence here is an insult to every Valorian who has devoted their life to protecting the royal family." He gestured toward the royal guards who lined the walls, and several of them nodded in agreement. "Perhaps a demonstration is in order," Calvarus continued, "so that we may all see exactly what humans are capable of." Sally's rose from her seat with anger blazing in her silver eyes. "Lord Calvarus," she began, "you go too far. I accept." Dayan said quietly. The princess turned to him with shock, and the noble smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent." Calvarus said, "3 of my personal guards against the human, and we shall see how long he lasts." The crowd murmured with excitement and anticipation as space was cleared in the center of the dining. Hao Dayan removed his formal jacket and handed it to the princess along with his sidearm. "You do not have to do this," she whispered urgently. "This is exactly what they want." "I know," he replied. "But sometimes you must show people what they fear to make them understand." He walked into the cleared space and faced the 3 Valorian guards who had stepped forward to challenge him. They were tall and graceful, and their crystalline skin shimmered in the light of the chandeliers. They moved like dancers, and their every gesture spoke of centuries of martial training. Dayan planted his feet and raised his hands and waited. The first guard attacked with a spinning kick that was beautiful and precise and utterly predictable. Dayan stepped inside the arc of the kick and drove his elbow into the guard's ribs and felt something crack beneath the impact. Guard crumpled, and Dayan was already moving toward the second Attica. Valorians fought with grace and artistry, and each movement flowed into the next like water. Humans fought to win. The second guard tried to grab Dayan's arm and throw him, but the human twisted free and delivered a brutal headbutt that sent the Valorian staggering backward with silver blood streaming from his nose. The third guard hesitated, and that hesitation cost him everything. Dayan closed the distance in 2 quick steps and drove his fist into the guard's throat and watched him fall, choking to the floor. 3 guards lay defeated in less than 30 seconds, and Dayan stood among them, breathing hard, but uninjured. The dining hall was completely silent. He looked at Lord Calvarus and saw fear in those silver eyes, not anger or humiliation, but genuine fear. Looked at the other nobles and saw the same fear reflected in their faces. They understood now what he was. He was not graceful or elegant or beautiful. He was efficient and brutal and unstoppable. He was human. Princess Sally's walked to his side and handed him his jacket, and her face held an expression of fierce pride. "Does anyone else wish to question my guardian's qualifications?" she asked the silent hall. No one spoke. They walked out of the dining hall together, and Dayan felt the weight of 100 stares on his back. That was terrifying. Sally said, once they were alone in the corridor, "I have never seen anyone fight like that. I'm sorry if I frightened you." Dayan replied, "You did not frighten me." She corrected, "You frightened them, and that is exactly what they needed." She looked at him with new understanding in her silver eyes. "They are not angry that a human guards me," she said slowly. "They are afraid of what humans truly are." "Yes," Dayan admitted, "and now they will think twice before threatening you." Later that night, Salias asked him about Earth, and about the wars humans had fought, and about why his species had evolved to be such effective killers. Told her the truth: humans came from a death world where everything wanted to kill them, and they had survived by becoming the most dangerous thing on the planet. "Does that frighten you?" he asked. "No," she answered. "It makes me feel safe." A messenger arrived at midnight with a report from Valorian intelligence. A second assassination attempt was being planned, and this time the forces involved were larger and better equipped. The enemy had allied with an external power, and they were coming for the princess and the Queen. Dayan read the report and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The real battle was coming, and he would be ready. Dayan opened his eyes to a ceiling made of crystal that caught the light and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the walls of the room. He was lying in a bed softer than anything he had ever felt before, and the sheets beneath him were woven from fabric that seemed to flow like water against his skin for a long moment. He simply stared at the beautiful ceiling and tried to remember how he had come to be in such a place. Then the memories returned and he sat up quickly and immediately regretted it as pain flared through his body. "You should not move so fast," said a gentle voice beside him, and Daeyeon turned to find Princess Sailey sitting in a chair that had been pulled close to his bed. She looked tired and her silver eyes held shadows that had not been there before, but she smiled when she saw him awake. "How long?" he asked, and his voice came out rough and dry. "3 days," she answered, and she reached for a cup of water and held it to his lips. "The healers were not sure you would survive, but I told them they were wrong." Daeyeon drank the water and felt some of his strength returning as the cool liquid soothed his throat. "You should not be here," he said when he could speak again. "This is improper for someone of your station. I have been here every day," the princess replied, and there was something like defiance in her voice. "The healers tried to make me leave, and my guards tried to make me leave, and even my mother tried to make me leave, but I refused." "Your mother?" Daeyeon repeated, and a new worry crept into his mind. "The queen knows about this. She knows everything," Sailey's confirmed, "and she wishes to speak with you when you are able." Daeyeon looked down at his bandaged chest and arms and tried to imagine what the queen of the Lorian Empire could possibly want with a human security officer who had simply done his duty. "I was only doing my job," he said quietly. "There is nothing special about that." The princess stared at him with an expression he could not read, and then she shook her head slowly. "You fought 6 assassins alone," she said. "You were wounded again, and you refused to fall, and you told me to run while you stayed behind to die. That is what soldiers do." Daeyeon replied, "No," Sailey said firmly. "That is what heroes do, and you cannot convince me otherwise." Before he could argue further, the door to the medical chamber opened and a figure entered that made Daeyeon instinctively try to rise from his bed. Despite his injuries, Queen Merethan was tall and elegant, with crystalline skin that shimmered like starlight and silver, hair that flowed past her shoulders like a waterfall of molten metal. She carried herself with the absolute authority of someone who had ruled an empire for centuries, and her silver eyes held depths of wisdom and power that made Daeyeon feel very small and very human. "Please remain in bed, Sergeant Yoon," the queen said, and her voice was melodic but carried an edge of command that could not be ignored. "You have lost much blood and need your rest." Daeyeon settled back against his pillows but kept his eyes on the queen as she approached his bedside. Sailey rose from her chair and stepped aside, but she did not leave the room. "Mother," the princess said softly, "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," the queen replied without looking at her daughter. "I have read the reports and reviewed the security recordings, and I understand exactly what happened." She turned her attention back to Daeyeon and studied him with those ancient silver eyes. "You killed 6 trained assassins," she said. "You sustained wounds that would have killed most Valorians 3 times over, and you continued fighting until every threat was eliminated." "I was doing my duty, Your Majesty," Daeyeon replied. "Your duty was to patrol the cargo bay and report any irregularities," the queen said. "Your duty did not require you to throw yourself between my daughter and 6 killers, or to order her to flee while you remained behind to die." Daeyeon had no response to that, and so he remained silent. "Do you know why those assassins came for my daughter?" the queen asked. "No, Your Majesty. They were sent by a faction within my own court that wishes to destabilize my rule," the queen explained. "By killing Sailey, they hope to weaken me politically and create chaos that they could exploit for their own ambitions." Her expression darkened, and Daeyeon saw something cold and dangerous flash in her silver eyes. "They have failed," she continued, "but they will try again, and next time they will send more assassins and better ones. Then the princess needs better protection." Dayan said without thinking. "Yes." The queen agreed. "She does." She studied him for another long moment, and then she spoke words that changed everything. "You will provide that protection." "Sergeant Yoon." Dayan blinked in confusion, and he was certain he had misheard her. "I'm sorry." "Your Majesty," he said, "I do not understand." "You will serve as my daughter's personal guardian," the queen clarified. "You will protect her from any threat, and you will remain by her side until I release you from this duty." "But Your Majesty," Dayan protested, "I am only a human, and I hold no rank of importance, and I have no training in royal protocol. You have something more valuable than any of those things." The queen replied, "You have already proven that you will die for her without hesitation, and that is worth more to me than 1,000 soldiers trained in ceremony and etiquette." Celie stepped forward with her silver eyes wide with hope and something else that Dayan could not identify. "Mother," she said, "are you certain about this?" "I am," the queen answered. "Valorian custom holds that when someone spills their blood to save another, a debt is created that binds the saved to the savior." She looked at Dayan with an expression that held both respect and warning. "My daughter owes you a debt that cannot be repaid with gold or titles," she said. "The only way to balance such a debt is through service and devotion, and so she will be bound to you as long as you live." "I do not want her bound to me," Dayan said quickly. "I do not want any reward or recognition, and I ask only to return to my duties and be forgotten. That is no longer possible." The queen replied, "You have saved a princess of the Valorian Empire, and the Empire does not forget such things." She reached out and placed her crystalline hand on his shoulder, and the touch was cool and smooth. "Like polished glass, you will heal," she said. "And when you are strong enough, you will take your place at my daughter's side, and you will protect her as you did in that cargo bay. And if I refuse?" Dayan asked quietly. The queen smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "You will not refuse," she said, "because you are a man who protects others without thought for himself, and you know that my daughter needs you." She was right, and Dayan hated that she was right. He looked at Celie's and saw the hope in her eyes and the trust that she had already placed in him, and he knew that he could not walk away from her. "Very well, Your Majesty," he said finally. "I accept." The queen nodded as if she had never doubted his answer. "Rest now," she commanded. "You will need your strength for what comes next." She turned and left the room with the grace of someone who had never known a moment of uncertainty in her entire life. Celis remained behind, and she moved back to her chair beside his bed and sat down with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do not thank me yet," Dayan replied. "The court will not accept a human as your guardian, and there will be many who try to remove me from this position. Let them try," the princess said with a fierce pride that reminded him of her mother. "I will stand beside you, and we will face them together." Dayan closed his eyes and wondered what he had gotten himself into, but somewhere deep inside him, a spark of something that might have been hope began to grow. He had been given a second chance and a purpose, and someone who believed in him, perhaps, that was worth fighting for after all. The first assassin lunged at Dayan with a blade that hummed with energy, and the human sergeant twisted aside at the last possible moment and brought his elbow crashing into the attacker's throat. The assassin crumpled, and Dayan grabbed his fallen blade and drove it through the chest of the second attacker, who had moved too close in the narrow space between containers. Blood sprayed across his face and hands, but Dayan did not pause to wipe it away, because the remaining 4 assassins were already pressing their attack. An energy blast caught him in the shoulder, and he felt his flesh burn, but the pain only sharpened his focus as he rolled behind a container and assessed his options. The cargo bay had become a maze of shadows, and Danger in every corner held the possibility of death. Dayan moved through the darkness like a ghost and used his knowledge of the layout to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. He had walked these corridors 100 times during his lonely patrols. And now that familiarity might save his life, an assassin appeared in front of him, and Dayan reacted without thought as he fired 2 shots into the attacker's center mass and watched him fall. 3 remaining, and they had learned to be cautious. Of the human who refused to die, his side burned where the earlier blast had struck him, and he could feel warm blood soaking through his uniform, but he pushed the sensation aside and kept moving. The service corridor where he had sent the princess was silent now, and he prayed that she had escaped while he drew the attention of the killers. A sound behind him made Dayan spin, and he found himself face to face with one of the remaining assassins who had circled around to cut off his retreat. They fought in close quarters with fists and blades and desperate strength. The assassin was taller and stronger, but Dayan was fighting with something beyond mere skill. He was fighting with the memory of every soldier he had failed to save, and the determination that he would not fail again. His blade found the assassin's throat, and hot silver blood sprayed across the cargo bay floor. 2 left, and Dayan was running out of strength. His wounds screamed at him to stop and rest, but he forced his legs to carry him forward through the maze of containers. He needed to lead them away from the service corridor, and he needed to buy more time for the princess to reach safety. A blast struck the container beside his head, and molten metal splashed across his arm, and the pain was so intense that he almost screamed, but he swallowed the sound and kept moving, because screaming would only tell them exactly where he was. The 2 remaining assassins had split up to hunt him, and Dayan knew that his best chance was to take them one at a time. He found a position between 2 tall containers and waited with his weapon raised and his breath coming in shallow gasps. Footsteps approached from the left, and Dayan held perfectly still until the assassin stepped into view. He fired, and the assassin fell, and now there was only one left, but that final assassin was the leader, and he was faster and smarter than the others. Dayan felt the blade enter his back before he even heard the movement behind him, and the pain was cold and sharp, and it stole the breath from his lungs. Turned and fired even as he fell, and the shot caught the leader in the face and dropped him to the floor. 6 assassins lay dead or dying around him, and Dayan collapsed against a container with blood pooling beneath his body. The pillar wound in his back was deep, and he could feel his strength fading with every heartbeat. He had done what he needed to do, and the princess was safe. And now he could finally rest. His eyes began to close, and the darkness felt welcoming after so much pain, but then he heard footsteps approaching, and they were light and quick and accompanied by the rustle of fabric. "No," said a voice that he recognized, and suddenly the princess was kneeling beside him with her white robes staining red as she pressed her hands against his wounds. "You were supposed to run," Dayan managed to say, and his voice came out weak and distant. "I did run," the princess replied, and her silver eyes were bright with tears. "I ran until I heard the shooting stop, and then I came back for you." "Foolish," he whispered. "Perhaps," she admitted, and her hands trembled as she tried to stop the bleeding that would not stop. "But I could not leave you here to die alone." She spoke words in her own language, and her hands began to glow with a faint silver light. Dayan had heard that Valorian royalty possessed healing abilities, but he had never seen them used before. The princess pressed her glowing hands against the wound in his back, and he felt warmth spreading through his body. "I am not trained for this," she said, and her voice shook with fear and effort. "I only know ceremonial healing, and I do not know if it will be enough." "Then stop," Dayan told her. "Save your strength and get to safety." "Be quiet," she ordered him, and for a moment she sounded exactly like her mother, the queen. "I will not let you die after you bled for me." Her hands moved across his wounds, and the silver light pulsed with each application of her Power Dayan watched her face as she worked, and he saw the horror in her eyes as she touched his blood. "It is red," she said softly, and her voice held wonder and confusion. "Your blood is red and warm." "Human blood," he confirmed. "I have never seen anything like it." She admitted, "Valorian blood is silver and cold, and yours is so different." She continued her healing work, and the worst of his wounds began to close under her touch, but the effort was draining her, and Dayan could see her skin growing pale and her movements becoming slower. "Stop," he said again. "You will hurt yourself." "I do not care," she replied fiercely. "You saved my life, and I will save yours." The cargo bay door burst open, and station security flooded in with weapons raised and lights blazing. They found the princess of the Valorian Empire kneeling in a pool of human blood with her white robes ruined beyond repair, and her hands pressed against the chest of a dying man. She looked up at them with silver tears streaming down her crystalline face, and she spoke with all the authority of her royal blood. "Help him," she commanded. "Help him now, or I will have every one of you executed." The security officers moved quickly after that, and they brought medical equipment and summoned healers, and did everything they could to save the human who had protected their. Princess Dahan felt himself being lifted onto a stretcher and carried through the cargo bay. His vision was fading, but he could still see the princess walking beside him with her hand gripping his. "Stay with me," she said, and her voice was the last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him. "You are not allowed to die." The medical team rushed him through the station corridors, and the princess refused to leave his side, even when her guards tried to pull her away. She had made her choice in that moment when she returned to the cargo bay. Instead of fleeing to safety, she had chosen to save the man who had bled for her, and she would see that choice through to the end. The doors of the medical bay opened, and the healers swarmed around Dayan and began their work to pull him back from the edge of death. Princess Celes stood in the corner with her ruined robes and her blood-stained hands and her silver eyes fixed on the human who had changed everything. Word spread quickly through the station about what had happened in the cargo bay. Human security officer had killed 6 assassins single-handedly, and the princess had refused to abandon him. And now Queen Merethan herself was traveling to the station to see the man who had saved her daughter. The dictators' political implications were enormous, but the princess did not care about politics. She only cared about the man on the medical table who was fighting for his life with the same determination he had shown when fighting for hers. She would not leave his side until he opened his eyes again. She owed him that much and so much more. Sergeant Yoon Dae-yun walked through the cargo bay with his hand resting on his sidearm and his eyes scanning every shadow between the metal containers that rose like towers around him. Valorian diplomatic station hummed with the quiet energy of 1,000 machines working in perfect harmony, and the air carried the faint sweet smell that the alien species seemed to produce naturally from their crystalline skin. Dayan had requested this posting 6 months ago after losing his entire squad in a border skirmish that still haunted his dreams, and the remote assignment suited him perfectly because nobody expected anything from the human security officer who patrolled the forgotten lower levels. The Valorians were an ancient and elegant people with skin that shimmered like living crystal and blood that ran silver through their veins, and they viewed humans as useful workers, but nothing more than that. He checked his communication device and noted that his shift would end in 3 hours, and then he could return to his small quarters and try to sleep without seeing the faces of the soldiers he had failed to save. A sound caught his attention, and he froze in place with every sense suddenly alert. Someone was moving between the containers ahead, and the footsteps were too light and too careful to belong to a maintenance worker. Dayan drew his weapon and advanced slowly through the maze of cargo until he rounded a corner and found himself facing someone he never expected to see in this part of the station. Princess Celes Varanthia stood before him with her silver eyes wide and her white robes trailing on the dusty floor, and she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and defiance that made her seem younger than her official portraits suggested. She was the youngest daughter of Queen Marethan, and her presence in the cargo bay was so unexpected that Daehan simply stared at her for a long moment. "You should not be here, Princess," he said finally, and his voice came out flat and calm despite his confusion. "And you should not tell me where I can and cannot go," she replied with a lift of her chin that spoke of royal arrogance. Daehan holstered his weapon and shook his head slowly because he had no interest in royal politics or noble gangs. "Your guards will be searching for you," he said. "Let them search," the princess answered, and she crossed her arms over her chest in a gesture that seemed almost human. "I am tired of being followed everywhere I go and treated like a precious object that might break if someone speaks too loudly near me." Daehan understood that feeling more than she could know, but he kept his expression neutral and his thoughts to himself. "The cargo bay is not safe for exploration," he said. "There are maintenance hazards and restricted areas, and you could easily become lost in here." The princess opened her mouth to argue, but then she stopped and tilted her head as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You do not bow," she observed. "You do not tremble or apologize or call me by my full titles. I am not Valorian." Daehan replied simply. Something changed in her silver eyes, and she almost smiled at him before a distant sound made them both turn toward the far end of the cargo bay. Daehan heard it before he understood what it meant, and the sound was the hiss of an airlock opening where no airlock should be opening at this hour. His hand moved to his weapon again, and this time he did not hesitate to draw it. "Stay behind me," he ordered the princess, and his voice carried an authority that made her obey without question. Through the gaps between containers, he saw figures emerging from the maintenance airlock, and they wore dark armor and carried weapons that gleamed with deadly purpose. 6 of them moved in perfect formation, and they communicated through hand signals rather than words, and everything about them screamed professional killers. Daehan grabbed the princess by the arm and pulled her into the shadow of a large container, and he pressed his finger to his lips to signal silence. "Assassins," he whispered, and the word made her face go pale beneath its crystalline shimmer. He activated his communication device, but received only static in response, and the realization hit him that the attackers had jammed all signals in this section of the station. Nobody was coming to help them. The princess trembled beside him, and he could feel her fear through the grip she had taken on his uniform sleeve. "I need to get you out of here," Daehan said quietly, and his mind raced through every possible escape route he had memorized during his months of patrol. But the assassins were already spreading out and blocking the main exits, and they moved with the confidence of hunters who knew exactly where their prey was hiding. One of them called out in a language Daehan did not recognize, and another responded with what sounded like coordinates. They knew the princess was here, and they were closing in. Daehan made his decision in the span of a single heartbeat, and he turned to the princess with eyes that held no fear. "When I move, you run toward the service corridor on the left," he told her. "Follow it until you reach the emergency lift and take it up to the main levels and find your guards." "What about you?" she asked, and her voice shook with something that might have been concern for him. "I will buy you time," he answered. "You cannot fight 6 of them alone," she protested, and her silver fingers tightened on his arm. "You will die." Daehan looked at her and saw not a princess, but a young woman who was terrified and alone and depending on him to survive this night. "Maybe," he admitted, "but you will live, and that is what matters." He did not give her time to argue, because the assassins were too close now, and every second of delay reduced their chances of survival. Daehan stepped out from behind the container and raised his weapon and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first shot struck an assassin in the shoulder and spun him around, and the second shot went wide, but the third found its mark in another attacker's leg. The remaining assassins turned toward him with their weapons rising, and Daeun ran in the opposite direction from the service corridor to draw their attention away from the princess. He heard her footsteps retreating and felt a moment of relief before the first energy blast scorched the air beside his head. Assassins pursued him through the cargo bay, and their shots illuminated the darkness with flashes of deadly light. Daeun ducked behind a container and returned fire and took down another attacker with a shot to the chest, but they were faster than him and better armed, and he knew he could not win this fight through firepower alone. He needed to be smarter, and he needed to be willing to do whatever it took to keep them occupied. An energy blast caught him in the side, and the pain was like nothing he had ever felt before, and he stumbled, but did not fall through the maze of containers he caught. A glimpse of the princess frozen at the entrance to the service corridor and staring back at him with horror in her silver eyes. "Run!" He shouted at her, and his voice echoed through the cargo bay like a command from the battlefield. She hesitated for one more moment, and then she turned and fled into the corridor, and Daeun allowed himself a single breath of relief. The assassins surrounded him now, and their weapons pointed at his chest, and their leader stepped forward with cold calculation in his alien eyes. "The princess has escaped," one of them reported. "Then we take what we can." The leader responded and gestured toward Daeun. "Kill the human and pursue the target." Daeun raised his weapon and faced 6 killers with nothing but his training and his determination, and the knowledge that every second he bought was a second the princess used to reach safety. Was not afraid to die. He was only afraid of failing to protect her.